and the story that in my view would be, yes, important, but would also just seem like we were trying to be sensational. Or are we going to look at the more important issue, and that is, had the church engaged in a cover-up, had it betrayed the very principles of the church itself, and had it sort of failed in its responsibility to protect children and their families, and essentially covered this up for decades? And the answer to that turned out to be yes, and we were able to document that. So I did actually ask to hold the story until we developed that bigger story. It's difficult to do today because of the internet. I mean, the internet was in its early stages, not so much early, but certainly broadband internet was in its early stages, and not that many people had access to the internet, really. There wasn't wide proliferation of the internet. There certainly weren't cell phones and mobile phones and, what have you. But these days, with the internet, there's so much competition that anybody can go down to a courthouse, just pull a document, get it up on the internet, and the whole world will see it, and it'll spread through social media. So it would be much more difficult to sit on a story now than it was then. And I probably at the time, if it were today, I probably would have published that story more immediately, and then gone for the bigger story subsequent to that. A lot of it would be trying to assess what does the competitive landscape look like at that moment, and if there's nobody else on the story, and we don't get wind of somebody else on the story, we might have waited. But as soon as we got wind of somebody else on the story, I suspect we would have published the first story.
Would you be afraid that another news outlet would have picked it up if you published the first story?
No, we were happy to have other news outlets pick up our story afterward. In fact, what actually happened is very few news outlets did pick up our stories initially from the Globe, for probably a variety of reasons. And some of the coverage was sort of critical of us, but national news outlets really didn't pay much attention to the Globe at the time. And as national news outlets sometimes do, is like pretend that it hasn't actually happened until we've written about it, which is a very bad practice, by the way. But then it became so big, and it consumed the church, and the church was having to implement reforms, and it became an issue in the Vatican that they couldn't ignore. They couldn't ignore what was happening. But I wouldn't worry about other people picking up the story.
So the Spotlight movie is for our generation what All the President's Men were for the previous generation. And you said that some...
Wait till I tell Bob Woodward that. I'll probably lose a friend.
So I know that you've said that some victims of the abuse have approached you and thanked you for the published series. So, as well for the portrayal of the investigation in the movie, what do you think are the lasting effects of the investigation?
Well, one of the lasting effects is what you see here today. 1,600 people here showing up who are interested in journalism. I can't attribute that. I can't entirely attribute that, obviously, to the movie, but the movie had an effect. I think a lot of people saw it. A lot of people were moved by it. Most importantly is that it helped communicate how important investigative journalism is to society, and how hard it is to do that work, what it takes to do investigative journalism in the right way, and why we need investigative journalism. And that was a bit of a revelation, I think, to the public, and also a revelation to people in our profession, believe it or not. Because at that stage, when the journalism profession was under such financial pressure, and it still is that there were a lot of people in our profession who, publishers and editors and owners, who felt that investigative reporting really wasn't something that they could continue to invest in, because it required a lot of time, it required a lot of money, and it didn't necessarily generate the kind of traffic that would lead to significant financial results at the time. But after people saw the movie, there were owners and publishers and editors who said, no, this is what we need to do. This is really important. It's central. It was a reminder that this kind of work is really central to our mission. And that this work is work that no one else will do unless we do it and do it right. So there were news organizations that reestablished investigative teams, who were hired more investigative reporters, and made that central to their news coverage. And it turns out that this is now actually, in my view, central to our business model, because we've shifted away from a business model solely based on advertising online to getting subscriptions for digital subscriptions to news. And what will people pay for? And what they will pay for is if they feel that you're doing work that's highly valuable to society, that no one else is doing, and that holds powerful people and powerful institutions accountable. And when we do that kind of work, people support us. When I was in Boston, every time we did an investigative piece by Spotlight, I would get emails from people saying, this is why I support the Boston Globe, this is why we need journalism, this is why I support you. And I felt like, gosh, I wish I got so many more emails like this. It's so much better than the other emails that I get from people. And I actually went to our Metro editor and said, can we have an investigative team in Metro? Spotlight's great, they do great work. Can we have an investigative team in Metro that turns these things around more quickly so I can get more emails like this? And we did. We created such a team. They've now merged the two, which is great, which makes sense. But we expanded our investigative reporting as a result of that, and I think other people have expanded their investigative reporting as well.
Would you say that an investigative team is essential for any paper?
Is it essential? I believe it's essential. I think it's critical to what our mission is. As I said, when James Madison essentially crafted the First Amendment, he talked about freely examining public characters and measures. The public characters are government officials and our politicians, and the measures are their policies. And so it's why the First Amendment was written. I mean, the First Amendment encompasses a variety of things. Obviously, it's not just free press, but free expression generally, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government for your grievances. All of those, including freedom of religion, are the idea that there are independent checks on government. The government doesn't dictate everything, and that it needs an outside check. But for the press, central to our mission is freely examining public characters and missions. That's been the idea since the beginning, and we can't forget that is central to our purpose.
And you touched on this in one of your earlier responses a bit, but diversity in newsrooms, because one of the challenges we face as journalists is representing all sorts of communities and identities in our coverage, even if we don't share those identities ourselves. So how do you think newsrooms could be better equipped to foster that sort of diversity and inclusion on staff? And how could we better communicate how we're doing that to the public?
Right. Well, it is important. I think it's important that we have a variety of people with a variety of experiences and life experiences and backgrounds in our newsroom. We do that through active recruiting of people. About 30% of our newsroom are people of color, and that's pretty good in the context of other news organizations. Obviously, there needs to be continued progress on that front, and certainly there needs to be continued progress in the senior levels within the newsroom as well. I look at diversity from not just people of color, but make sure that it's people of all different backgrounds, and people who grew up on farms, people who served in the military. I mean, actually the military is an area that I have particular interest in because we've now been at war for 18 years. 18 years of this country has been at war, and so a lot of Americans have served in the military, And it's important that within our newsrooms we have people who've served in the military, who have that perspective. And one thing that I never do, though, is to say that there's a litmus test on political ideology. We never ask anybody about their political ideology. I don't care what their political ideology is, and we never will ask a question like that. There are people with a variety of views. There is not uniformity of opinion, but it's not something that we will ever ask about.
And going off that, another issue college journalists face is navigating tensions over First Amendment rights on campus. Sometimes speakers will purposely seek out a campus with messages that some view as hateful. So what advice do you have for us on like educating our communities on the importance of the First Amendment while navigating that?
Right. Well, it's a really important issue, and there are several recent polls recently that show declining support among college students for the First Amendment. That people feel that maybe there's more, that they put higher priority on the idea of inclusion, as it's called, over the First Amendment, that they would restrict what they consider to be hate speech, which is difficult to define. I think it's important to remind people what the First Amendment covers again. And it's not just freedom for those of us who are in the press. It's freedom for everyone to speak their minds. It's freedom for you to watch the movies that you'd like to watch. It's freedom for you to listen to the music that you'd like to watch. It's freedom for you to have the kinds of conversations with your friends that you feel you should have without fear that if somebody says you said something that could lead to your prosecution or imprisonment. And so we all have a stake in that. I think that my own personal view of college is that it's almost as if people should, before somebody goes to college, they should sign a waiver saying, I'm now an adult. I recognize that I'm going to hear opinions that I might not agree with, that some of them I'm going to find offensive, and if I disagree with them, I'll make clear I disagree with them, but I'm not going to shut them down. And so I think that people should recognize that that's part of society. I think we should be, when we're in college, there should be preparation for the rest of your life. And once you get out of college, there isn't going to be a college administrative structure to shut down speech. And so you have to learn, how to deal with people you disagree with, or information that you find hateful. And the way to do that is to signal your opposition to that. And there are ways to signal your opposition to that that don't involve telling people they can't speak, but showing that there are greater numbers of people who think otherwise, and that there is a good reason to think otherwise. And that's what I favor.
So we want to ask a couple questions specifically about work habits and advice for young journalists. So it's been said that you are the first in the office and the last to leave the office. So what are your best tips for newcomers entering the business?
Well, that's certainly not the case anymore. First of all, I'm getting older, It's hard to roll out of bed in the morning. Thanks for setting this up for 11. I was actually in the office at 8 o'clock. So, and plus we're a 24-hour news operation. We have people who are working overnight, so I'm definitely, it's just not possible. What do I think? The advice that I have generally for people who are getting into the profession is recognize that it's not a 9-to-5 job. Recognize that when somebody asks you to do something, the best answer is yes. And okay, I'll get right on it. It's 5 o'clock, I gotta go. I think that's what people want, is they want to see enthusiasm. We want to see a lot of different things. We want to see enthusiasm, we want to see energy, we want to see creativity, we want to see curiosity about the world. We want to see keen interest in how to communicate the facts. We want to see rigor in the methodology that people are using. That's what we're looking for. Look, I mean, things happen at all hours. I mean, it doesn't mean that people have to work 24 hours a day, but it may mean that somebody needs to stick around for an hour to do something, or they get called on the weekends, or they get a call at night, or something like that. I mean, I'll tell you, the people who are covering the White House, and covering national security and covering Congress these days, they're working a lot. And they're having to sort of jump into stories when they thought they were finished for the day, but they never really finished for the day. And that's what, I mean, for some people they can't handle that. Other people find that exhilarating, but it is a feature of the job.
What is something you wish you would have known as a new journalist that you'd like to share?
Oh, wow. That is a question I haven't been asked. What do I wish I had known? I don't know. When I first started, I wish I had known how little I was going to be paid. My $200 a week was, didn't seem like enough. But I got over that quickly. This is probably not that much, because, the reality is that working on a school paper which I did. I was editor of my college paper and at Lehigh University, and we just celebrated the 125th anniversary of that newspaper up at Lehigh, and is that it was really good preparation for the rest of my career. Amazingly good preparation for the rest of my career. I discovered that when I would write stories, that some people might be angry, that some people would confront me about them. I discovered that people felt that in many instances it was none of our business to cover certain kinds of subjects, when I felt, in fact, it was our business to do so. I learned a lot about, how to gather information. I learned about the power of using the right word and the dangers of using the wrong word. There's so much that I learned. I learned about the time that it took to do it. Probably for many of you, I certainly spent more time working on the school paper than I did doing the other things that one supposedly is doing in college, so it was great preparation that way. And so I think when I went into the field, I don't feel that I was unprepared for what was to come later. And I think that probably, one of the things that people need to adjust to in a newsroom, now that I think about it, is just the number of people you have to work with and the ways that you're working. It's not just that you have to work collaboratively with all sorts of other people, particularly these days when it comes to, storytelling that involves video and audio and animation and interactive graphics and all the things, but also collaboratively as reporters working together on a story, and working across departments, and also, and then when you get into editing, as people who work for you and how to work with those different types of editors. I wish I had learned greater patience earlier in my career. That did not come immediately, for sure, and it came later. Still working on it, and then how to manage up, how to manage your bosses is really important too. How to communicate with your bosses, and then there's of course the communication with the public, which is important. So that communication and that management in multiple directions is incredibly important. And that's almost certainly something that I did not, now that you've asked me the question, that is something that I did not fully appreciate, and was not, to put it mildly, was not a well-developed skill on my part. So.
We're going to have one last question up here, but if you guys want to start lining up to ask questions for Marty, we'll go to the floor. So, last question up here.
So some school administrators, they're making an increased effort to protect the brand of the university. This can result in things such as delayed responses to questions, or no responses, or to deliberate disinformation campaigns. So the Post is owned by a public figure who is arguably concerned about stories about him and his personal life, and how those might affect his business interests. So what tips from your team's approach to covering those stories would you offer to college journalists?
Who could you be talking about? Look, I mean, we're owned by Jeff Bezos, obviously the founder of Amazon. We're not part of Amazon. We're completely separate. We're owned by him personally. The president likes to call us the Amazon Washington Post. It's ridiculous because we just do our thing. They do their thing. They're gigantic. We're small. And so, you know, when Jeff acquired us, he said at his first meeting with the staff, cover me the way that you would cover any other person, and cover Amazon the way you would cover any other company. And he's reiterated that on multiple occasions, and he has stood by that. Our view is that we're going to cover them the way we cover any other organization, we don't seek his opinion. He doesn't interfere. He's never criticized a story. He's never expressed a story. He's never critiqued a story. Never suggested a story. He hasn't done any of that. He gets involved in the sort of business tactics and strategies of the company, but he doesn't interfere in the coverage. And so, you know, people ask me, am I worried about that, his ownership and his business interests? And the answer to that is, maybe I would have been worried about that at the beginning, but it's been 6 years of his ownership and he hasn't interfered at all, and so I have no worries today. So we do what we think we should do, and I think that we should have a moral compass at the organization, and our moral compass tells us we should cover that company and every other company exactly the same way, and that individual and all other individuals exactly the same way. And that's what we do. And as of today, there hasn't been a single person of the Post who has said, either on the record or off the record, that their coverage was at all influenced by Jeff Bezos. Not one. And I think that says a lot. Speaks volumes.
Okay, so when you step up to the mic, state your name, your publication, and where you're from, city, and then ask your question. We'll start over here on my right.
I think I'm on. There I am. Hi, my name is Margaret Craig. I'm the news editor for the Pacific Sentinel from Portland, Oregon. But I grew up in D.C. reading the Post, and my question was actually about Jeff Bezos as well. But generally speaking, what does it mean for media that more influential companies are getting involved with owning media?
Right. Well, we're not owned by a major company. We're not owned by Amazon. So we're owned by Bezos individually. That's first of all. Look, ever since I've been in the profession, people have complained about the form of ownership of media. Every form of ownership has come under is questioned. Many years I worked for Knight Ridder, which no longer exists. It was a public company owned by shareholders. I worked for the New York Times Company, which was also a public company owned by shareholders, but with a controlling interest. I worked for the Times Mirror, which owned the LA Times, a publicly owned company. The public and the employees, they complained about public ownership because it meant short-term profitability, They weren't investing enough in the journalism, and wouldn't it be better if we were a nonprofit? Okay, so then let's switch to nonprofits. So, when you're a nonprofit, you're still subject to the laws of economics. It doesn't inoculate you from the laws of economics. So if your revenue is declining, you're going to feel it. So you take a place like the Tampa Bay Times, owned by a nonprofit, has the same impact. When you're not making any money, you're having to make cuts, what have you. Many of the nonprofits which receive monies from, which are charitable organizations which receive donations, the problem is that there isn't enough charities to support most of those nonprofits, to support news organizations in all of your towns and cities and in your states. There's just not enough money there, not enough charitable support for that. And so you can't count on that as a way of providing coverage, providing the coverage in all the places that actually need it. So that's a form of ownership that may work in some specialized instances, and does in some specialized instances, and there are some great nonprofits, but it's not going to work across the entire country or across the world. And then people say, okay, well, all right, so we don't have nonprofits. What about these rich people who are buying news organizations? Okay, well, let's see. All I can say is, so we don't want public companies. Nonprofits aren't going to be able to do the job, and we have a problem with rich people buying it. Well, what is your answer exactly for the form of ownership that we should have? Because there are a limited number of options available, and if you're going to have a real news organization that can do real work, that can actually pay reporters and pay editors and pay photographers and graphics artists and what have you, do expensive investigative reporting, that it actually needs real resources. So presumably there's some ideal out there, but no one has been able to clarify for me, like, what is that ideal that's actually going to work at the national level and in all of your communities. So my view is that as far as wealthy people getting involved in journalism, as long as they have the right motives, and they support the cause of journalism, they support the mission of journalism, they allow us our journalistic independence, I'm fine with that, and I'm fine with other forms of ownership as long as they too are committed to those kinds of principles.
Over here.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Riley Grazzini. I'm the editor-in-chief at the Shield at the University of Southern Indiana in Evansville, Indiana. But this question is in regard to the al-Baghdadi headline that the Post wrote. So kind of what is your process for, writing and editing controversial headlines? And, how do you handle the backlash that you get from publishing those headlines?
Right. Well, first of all, that was a unfortunate headline. It was up for a brief period of time, and it was done on a weekend, and it was not the initial headline on the story, which the initial one called him terrorist in chief. So, first of all, just a little background here that I think I should explain. Number one is, for years now, we have sent our correspondents into Syria and Iraq to cover ISIS, to cover the brutality of ISIS, to document the savagery of that organization. The reason that our readers know so much in such horrific detail about that organization is because our reporters took enormous risks, personal risks, risking their lives to document that brutality. We're fully aware. We are, if you take a look at it, we have had a freelancer who worked for us in Syria, Austin Tice, has now been kidnapped. He's been gone for 7 years. He was working in Syria. He's been gone for 7 years. And we are working with other news organizations to find him and to get him released. We had a correspondent in Iran, placed in the worst prison in Iran for 544 days. We had an opinion columnist, Jamal Khashoggi, who walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, who was assassinated by a team sent by the Saudi government. He was dismembered, and his body has yet to be found. And our colleagues who work for other journalistic organizations have had their colleagues killed by ISIS. So the notion that somehow we celebrated ISIS, or that somehow we glossed over it is just preposterous and outrageous. So what we had was we had an initial headline on a story. There was an obituary written, by the way, by a guy who wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about ISIS called Black Flags, widely recognized as one of the best books written about ISIS. An editor decided to change the headline, who was working on that weekend, felt that they needed a headline that there was an obvious intent to try to capture what was the basis, how did Baghdadi lure people to his support, attract people to support him? How did he radicalize those groups? And how did he mobilize those individuals? And the way that he did that is that he had a religious philosophy that was a severe religious philosophy, and that attracted them. And so she was trying to sort of indicate, so what was his, how did he begin and how did he end? And so, unfortunately we use this phrase, austere religious scholar, and the headline for a brief period of time did not communicate the brutality of ISIS. So other editors saw that, recognized the failure of the headline, and changed it. And so, the reason, as I mentioned earlier, we do make mistakes. That was a mistake. We immediately acknowledged that mistake when we were asked about it, and said that it should never have been written that way. And the reason that we make mistakes is because we're human. And like all humans, we make mistakes. But we don't make mistakes because we lack humanity. We obviously know a lot about ISIS. We fully understand its brutality and its savagery. We've dedicated our reporters to covering that. Reporters who put their lives at risk to cover that. And for people to suggest that somehow we celebrated that individual is really preposterous.
Hi, my name is Mark Rotundo. I am the chief copy editor for the POW at St. Peter's University in Jersey City, New Jersey, which is New York City for people who can't afford to live in New York City. And so I have two questions. My first question is, what in your opinion do you see as being some of the biggest mistakes that those in media and journalists are making in the modern age? What can current journalists and the journalists of tomorrow do to better improve their reporting so as to make news that much more reliable and important? And my second question is, given Donald Trump's relentless attacks against the media and the free press, there's been a visible uptake in the amount of individuals, especially in his base, who don't just distrust the media but disdain them. My question is, why do you think there are people that resonate with this message, and what can we do to restore the trust that we lost in these people?
All right, and so, I'm sorry, so there are three questions there?
Two.
Is that right?
No, there's two. It's basically, what do you think are some of the biggest mistakes that people in media and journalists are making today, and what can we do to fix it and make news that much more reliable?
I don't know. I mean, I think that one of the mistakes that people make is that, there are any number of them, but is that people seem to view comment as just something that you just plug into a story. I think it's really important. They send you an email and they say, I need your comment, and then they just plug it into a story that's already written. I think it's really important when we think about soliciting comment from people is that the purpose there is to actually hear what they have to say, to actually listen to them, to be open to what their perspective, and take that into account when writing a story. It's not to say, I check that off on the list of things that I'm supposed to do is to get comment, and I included that in the story. It's to actually listen to people and listen to what they have to say, and take it into account in formulating that story. And I think it's really important that we always be willing to challenge our own hypotheses, the hypothesis that perhaps launched us on a story, and to be willing to abandon a story or certainly to adjust the story based on what somebody is saying. That's not an argument that everything that everybody says is equal. I mean, we have all sorts of reporting that goes into stories, but it does mean that we actually have to listen. And the second question is on why do people disdain us? Well, it's interesting because this is not an entirely new phenomenon. 100 years ago, a book was written called Liberty in the News, written by Walter Lippmann. It was written exactly 100 years ago, and the book was published then ultimately published in 1920. And in that book, he talks about people's distrust of the news, the same thing that we talk about today. And so this has been going on for a long time. I think the difference today is that we live in a far more polarized society than we did at the time, and we are devolving into a form of tribalism in the country, where people identify with their particular tribe, which has a particular ideology, and anything that contradicts what that tribe is supposed to believe is dismissed or denied or not even listened to, or disdained, as you put it. And that's unfortunate because I do think that we have to have a common set of facts to actually have a democracy function. And I worry about the sharp polarization that takes place in this country. And it has an impact not just on us, but it has an impact on us in this profession, but it has an impact on democracy as a whole.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Peter Edgar. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Florida Southern College in Lakeland, Florida. You said a little while ago that we need to be writing about everyone in the country. How can we, and how does the Post specifically support, promote, and uplift local journalism in underreported areas within the United States?
Well, I don't know that when Jeff Bezos acquired us, our company was really struggling. We were losing money. We were trying to find a sustainable business model. And we've been working over the last half dozen years since that acquisition to make sure that we have a sustainable business model for the Washington Post. So our first priority is our own news organization to make sure that it in fact succeeds as an independent news organization. We want to be helpful to other news organizations, but it's not, we can't do everything for everybody around this country. There are thousands of news organizations around this country, and a good portion of them are really struggling. So, I don't know that the Post can really do that much ourselves. I think people are going to have to find a model of their own. I personally get involved in that in a variety of ways. I'm on the board of the Knight Foundation, which has launched a major news initiative, a major initiative to support local journalism, nonprofit journalism, as well as journalism that's practiced by commercial enterprises, and they're actually making huge grants for that purpose. So I support it that way. I certainly support news literacy projects, and I'm somewhat involved in that as well. And but I don't know that the Post can be all that helpful to local news organizations. They're going to have to find their own models.
Nick Ketchum, Deputy Editor of the Washington Voice. Thank you for being here. I've noticed over the last 10, 15, 20 years a change in types of reporting, especially in entertainment. We all know The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, and the #1 news source, The Onion. And my question would be, is entertainment or comedy a new form of communication for news when we have these divisions or these tribalizations? And would that is that attracting an audience because it's effective and because there's some accuracies in entertainment and comedy? And does that affect how you do things at the Post? Because you're a serious organization, so I assume you're trying to attract readers. But how do you do that in the face of the Daily Show and the Onion?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a form of communication. I don't consider it to be news. It's a way that a lot of people get their news, and I don't know that it affects the way that we go about our work. I mean, some of our work gets amplified through those through those entertainment programs because they pick it up and use it as material. But I actually think I mean, those shows are fine. I don't think they should be people's primary source of information. I think a subscription to a high-quality news organization, and I have one in mind, would be really a good idea. But it's true that a lot of people get their information out of that. I don't know that it doesn't have an impact on us, but it does have an impact on how people receive their information. And I don't think it's an ideal way to get your information.
It doesn't crowd you out at all? The younger...
I don't know that we're being crowded out. You're younger people, you're really difficult to reach. It's true. You're a real problem. And how do you guys work on solving that? So the truth is, we actually reach quite a few. I mean, the Post has about 30% of its audience online are millennials, and so we actually and we have a very large audience. So we're reaching people. Obviously, it's much smaller than that when it comes to subscriptions. Every year I meet with our interns, and when I did that in Boston too, and I remember when we implemented our paywall in Boston, our interns who were college students said that, well, it's unfortunate because, college students really can't afford a subscription. And I said, well, that's not true. And they looked at me like, what are you talking about? And I said, how much do you spend on beer every week? And how much do you spend at Starbucks every week? And I saw some people who bought Starbucks over there. And how expensive is that? Well, it's a lot more expensive than a subscription to a newspaper over the course of the year. If you get 1 cup of coffee or 2 cups of coffee over the course of a year. So it's a matter of how you choose to spend your money. It's not a matter of whether you have the money. You have the money. You just choose to spend it on other things. And so we have to persuade people through the work we do that ours is a worthy place for them to spend their money. So that's what we try to do.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Andrew Liao. I'm with Golden Gate Express from San Francisco. And my question is, in an era of distrust in the media, do you feel that it's the Post and other newspaper organizations or just media outlets in general's responsibility to educate the public on how we as journalists and reporters but going to the public firsthand and saying, look, this is how we do the process. You may feel like we get the stories wrong sometimes or get the facts wrong, but this is how we do it.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I think that one of the ways that we can address the issue of being more transparent about how we go about our work. So we do talk a lot in a lot of our stories about how many people we spoke to, and we do try to show more of the original documents that we are using. So court documents, transcripts, video that accompanies our stories, things like that. We can't do that on every story, and certainly when we're quoting anonymous sources, as we have to these days, and have had to for quite some time, is that obviously there's a limit to what we can disclose. But to the extent that we can disclose information, yes, I think we should be more transparent. We should try to be more transparent about it.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nolan Cleary. I am a writer. I'm the political columnist for the Hudsonian newspaper. I want to go back to the al-Baghdadi story. One of your writers got in trouble for implying, or according to some people, implying that it was wrong for President Trump to call al-Baghdadi a coward. Do you fear that this, along with the headline controversy about him being an astute political scholar, portrays the Post in a negative light?
Well, we never called him an astute political scholar, by the way. That's not
Or
the
sorry,
phrase.
religious.
Yeah, we said religious scholar. That's what we
That's
said.
what I
We
would
didn't
say.
say astute religious scholar. Look it up. On the first part of the question, I have no idea who you're referring to, because
One of the writers for the Washington.
Who's the writer? Who's the writer?
Well,
Max Boot is an opinion writer. I have nothing to do with the opinion section, so you're asking the wrong person.
Okay.
I'm not involved in the opinion department. I oversee our news and features coverage, and if you have a question about a columnist, you need to ask somebody else.
Do you fear that it hurts their image of the paper?
I'm sorry, what?
Do you fear it hurts the image of the paper? That was my question.
I don't even express opinions about our opinion columnists. I don't express opinions about our editorials. I don't express opinions about our opinion columnists. I don't get involved in that area of our news organization. I'm not in charge of the opinion department.
Hello, my name is Victoria Stringer, and I'm an opinion columnist at the Trinitarian. Sorry.
Notwithstanding that, I'll try to answer your question.
It's not related to opinion stuff. So, you indicated that Post employees are never asked about their political ideologies. But in this day and age, political ideologies can be tied up in racist and xenophobic views, especially with the rising wave of white nationalism. Obviously, you aim for a workforce that is diverse in its beliefs, but when one's beliefs directly oppress a group or groups of people, how is that dealt with? And at what point is respecting another's personal beliefs enabling or creating space for oppression?
Right. Well, look. I mean, if we had evidence that anybody on our staff was a racist, that person wouldn't be on our staff any longer. If we have as part of our culture, and it's actually written down, modes of behavior for people on our staff on how they're supposed to treat each other and regard each other, and that involves mutual respect, and we require that. Fortunately, we don't have those people on our staff that you're talking about, and that instance, as far as I know, has never come up. Certainly not something that I've had to deal with. And so, but if it did, we would not permit that kind of behavior, or permit that person to practice in our newsroom.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Corey Zanes. I'm the managing editor with the State Hornet, and I'm a political science and journalism major at Sac State. My question is really just, since you're the executive editor for probably the best coverage of politics in our country, what is your advice for someone like me who wants to get into journalism and cover politics?
Go do it. I guess, start covering politics at, either, look for a job with some organization here in Washington that's covering politics at the national level, or better yet, try to start covering politics at a local or state level with a news organization that does that, and get experience and learn, learn your way. The best way to do things is to just go do them. So I would just look for opportunities that way.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Marty Barron. My name is Brittany.
By the way, I don't know which way to look because the lights are so bright. I'm just trying to look down the middle here because I have no idea who's speaking here.
I'm over here on your left.
Okay, thank you.
So, my name is Brittany. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Southwestern College Sun in California, but I'm born and raised on Guam. My question is, how much energy should be put in getting the story out first versus getting an in-depth reporting that you know for sure is correct?
Yeah. Well, making sure it's correct is the top priority. Obviously, speed is just part of our the environment right now. Is that there's a lot of competition. You try not to be last, and on the other hand, you don't want to put it out unless you're absolutely sure that it's correct. But certain stories are developing stories, and so you may get out the initial facts, but then you develop those. You keep reporting it, and then you develop a deeper and deeper story. Look, a story is not finished even when it appears on your website or in a newspaper. Inevitably, there's more to explore.
Okay, thank you so much. It's an honor to meet you.
Thank you.
We have time for 2 more questions. So one, and then back over here.
I'm Sabaran, thank you for being here. My name is Henry Morelli. I'm a computer science major. I'm the opinion editor of the Texas A&M Battalion, and I'm originally from Nairobi, Kenya. My question is, I was curious about your thoughts on 2 very different but I think related incidents. One was the reaction by the executive editor of your competitor, the New York Times, to the headline they posted on President Trump's comments on the El Paso shooting. And the second one, I don't know if you've read about this, but the president of the Harvard Crimson, they wrote an editorial about the reaction of students on campus to them seeking comment from ICE on an on-campus anti-ICE protest. So my question is, I guess, where do you draw the line between responding to reader concerns versus not reflexively replying to every disgruntled reader?
Right. Well, I'm not going to comment about the New York Times because I don't like to comment about our competitors, and I don't want to. And I have great respect for that news organization and for the editor of the New York Times, who, by the way, happens to be a friend of mine. And I just don't think there's any useful purpose in commenting on that. So, with regard to Harvard Crimson did the right thing. Look, our job is to talk to everybody. And the idea that there would be a protest against ICE and you wouldn't actually call ICE because somehow they're not worth talking to, or that it's somehow offensive to actually talk to the subject of the subject of the protest. I mean, to me, that just violates every principle of journalism, and I think it's crazy. And that's a path that we don't want to go down. When people are being criticized, whether it's an individual or an institution, we absolutely have an obligation to go talk to them and hear their perspective, and to include that. And that's a fundamental principle of journalism. It has been for a very long time. And the notion that that people are beyond, that people don't deserve to be talked to, is something that we never want to embrace that in our profession.
Hi, I'm Julia Donahue. I'm an editor for the Amherst Wire at UMass Amherst, and coming from Boston, it's clearly a homogenous environment. So how do you suggest from any level, whether a young journalist, editor-in-chief, how do you break through in such a homogenous newsroom and culture and make impact?
Well, where are you from in Boston? Because it's not all homogenous. So, I mean, there's actually, there's a large African-American community in Boston. There's a large immigrant community in Boston. I know a lot of Latinos in Boston. Now, they may not be adequately represented in business or in government or politics or what have you, but one of the things I tried to do when I was in Boston is to make sure that I did meet people throughout the community, including people within the African-American community. Look, there's a large Cape Verdean community in Boston, and so large Dominican community in Boston, and Puerto Rican community in Boston. So, so the question is, how do you run that by me one more time?
how do you break through the homogenous thought in Boston or an area like that?
Well, look, I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I mean, I think that